going back to my whitewater background, I mean, it was kind of always self-supported. You know, when you go into a gorge and you're within those walls and you've got to navigate a bunch of class 5 rapids in certain cases to get from point A to point B, it's just you, that's it. You know, some of the rivers that we went to, if anything ever went wrong, you know, there's nobody that could even actually physically put themselves in that environment and navigate the waterways to get to where you are. So that's, you know, self-support in its purest form.
Welcome to the Spartan Endurance Series on Spartan Up Podcast with host Johnny Waite.
Hey Spartans, Johnny Waite here, one of the hosts of the Spartan Up Podcast. We have Ben Friberg back again today for another special endurance episode. Ben is an unbelievable paddler. He has paddled in some of the most remote regions of the world. He's also the race director of Chattajack, the 50-kilometer race in the Tennessee River. And today Ben's going to talk to us about how to prepare for an event that you're not going to be able to have outside support for. So how to make sure that you are ready to go out and do this on your own. Very, very important before you dive into these big, big adventures.
This episode of Spartan Up is brought to you by True Form Runner. Conquer your next race with a complete training solution from Spartan and True Form. The Spartan True Form trainer will redefine your running, improve your form, and reduce injury. Save 10% with the code SPARTAN10 at trueformrunner.com/Spartan. That's trueformrunner.com/Spartan.
Hey Spartans, we're back for another endurance episode with Ben Friberg, and Ben is the race director of Chattajack. It's become a very famous paddle race down in Tennessee, from Chattanooga to the Nickajack River, or the Nickajack Lake actually. And but he's also done some incredible adventures of his own. And last time he was telling us about paddling 1,000 miles on the Yukon River with his wife, paddling 238 miles in 24 hours down a raging river, paddling way upriver in Papua New Guinea into pretty much uncharted territory. And we talked a lot about the amount of support that you need for some of these big events and the importance of putting together a support team. And so I encourage you to go back and watch that episode if you haven't seen it. But today we're going to talk about the events that you don't get to bring in outside support for. So the preparation that goes into a self-supported event. And one of the things that Ben really taught us on the last one was that the amount of preparation that goes into an event, you know, the bigger the event, the more important that preparation. And I called it the pre-preparation, because what we think of preparation is, you know, just grabbing your stuff and getting ready to go. And Ben's talking about the planning and the organizing and that sort of stuff. So Ben, I'm going to assume that that's one thing that carries over, that even if it's a self-supported event, that preparation is important. But I want you to give some examples of some self-supported events you've done and some things you've learned about what it's important to have, to do, and to know.
Okay. Going back to my whitewater background, I mean, it was kind of always self-supported. You know, when you go into a gorge and you're within those walls and you've got to navigate a bunch of class 5 rapids in certain cases to get from point A to point B, it's just you, that's it. You know, some of the rivers that we went to, if anything ever went wrong, you know, there's nobody that could even actually physically put themselves in that environment and navigate the waterways to get to where you are. So that's, you know, self-support in its purest form. And
describe what class 5 is for somebody who doesn't know. You know, that's pretty much the highest classification of whitewater. So what would that describe?
Class 5 in my mind, and that can be a little bit of you know, a relative term, but when I think of class 5, I think of very consequential waterways. You know, could be big waterfalls, could be big hydraulics, very congested rapids. You know, there's often very there can be large undercut rocks and strainers. I mean, it's essentially you're navigating waters that have a very small margin with, you know, when I think of class 4 is a little less stressful. It can be big and fun. And, you know, there's a few places that you don't want to go to. Class 5 is, like, in my mind, it's like places like you can't flip upside down. If you flip upside down, you will probably be unconscious, and
So,
then you
so
need your team to help you.
yeah, I'm going to put it in these terms to someone. If you've ever looked at water and thought, I don't think somebody could paddle through that,
Yeah.
that's class 5. So I'm not saying to a paddler it's not, but to somebody who just looks and goes, nobody could ever paddle through that,
Sure.
and then someone paddles through it, that's what class 5 is.
Yeah. I mean, I've been on rivers before where there've been people that are like standing on the side and they're like, please tell me you're not about to go through that. I think most class 5 whitewater paddlers have had, days like that where there's like a, tourist saying that, or a guy who's like, I'm a doctor and I'm just telling you I'll be here if anything goes wrong, whatever. But yeah, so that's class 5. And that kind of gets to what you're talking about where it's self-support, because most of the time class 5 is, there are a few places that have roadside access to class 5 rapids, but a lot of the times you're in a gorge with, massive walls. It could be completely cliffed out, or it could be just very steep. And so if anything goes wrong, you've got another problem to solve. And so that's
Sure.
self-support.
And then you were saying that, sort of going back to your whitewater days, going forward from your whitewater days to your stand-up days. I mean, that's what a lot of people know you as now, is a guy who is a real leader in the stand-up paddle community, and as a race director at Chattajack, but also in some of the events you've done as well. So when I think about the people coming into the Spartan world, or sorry, into the endurance world through Spartan, a lot of it is from a running background and terrestrial based racing, but they may or may not be aware of some of the long distance races that are there in the paddle communities. For example, 50 kilometers down the Tennessee River, anywhere from 5 to 8.5 hours of nonstop paddling. You did 24 hours of nonstop paddling down the Yukon River, 238 miles on a pretty raging river. But give us some examples of long endurance events that sort of translate to running. Even though you're standing and paddling, you can get your head wrapped around it as a runner. What would be a long race, distance and time wise, and in terms of one that's reasonably self-supported, how would one prepare for that?
Hopefully they have some experience, ahead of time. And hopefully they have like kind of the vision and the foresight where they can just think of all the variables that are going to come into play, whether it's, the technical variables, maybe garments that they will need for the various conditions that they could see, to look where your event is going to take place. Are you going to be dealing with cold? Are you going to be dealing with heat? Are you going to be dealing with blisters? Where might you get those blisters? And how, hopefully too, it's great to be able to have the experience so that you know how to adjust, so that no matter what happens, for my one thing that like I'm comfortable with is if I start to get cold and I'm paddling and my vision slows down, which is like maybe a first sign of like a little bit of hypothermia, which that could also happen if I'm just running or whatever. I'm accustomed to that, and I don't there's no panic or anything like that. And a lot of times, hopefully my core temperature is warm. And that's actually kind of a comfortable place for me to be, as long as I'm not making mistakes. But to me, I'm always just like, wow, I love being in situations like that, because it's kind of like, I actually even wrote a song about this one time called Painted Corners. People talk about, if you're painting, say, the floor, and then you paint yourself into a corner, well, then you have a problem.
Yep.
But it's also kind of cool to think that you can go to remote places like that and experience something like that. And it's whether you're by yourself, which I kind of consider as like, now we're kind of getting into the spiritual stuff, but that's almost like a vision quest type thing to me. But you might also be with a group of 2 or 3 or 4 other people, and you're all kind of in that same mental space where it's like nothing can go wrong right now, because if it does, then we've got something really unique on our hands, and we need to continue to progress forward, so that way we have safety, whatever that means.
Well,
but
one nugget that you touched on there, I just don't want to get away from it. When you talked about that, because you've put yourself out there and your comfort level with hypothermia, for example. And I think it's really important that when you're getting into bigger events and you're getting to a self-supported situation, that you've mocked it up to some degree, or at least had some experience with something similar. So if you haven't paddled in cold weather to know how you respond to it and to know how you can react to it, and then the first time you find out about that is in the middle of a unsupported event in the middle of nowhere, you're going to get yourself in trouble. A small example, I was telling a friend the other day, when I started doing longer ultra running, and I'd never bonked, I'd never completely crashed from a caloric standpoint or a blood sugar standpoint, and I knew it was going to happen at some point. So I thought, rather than this happen for the first time 60 miles out onto a trail where nobody's around me, I want to know how I'm going to react. So in my last Toronto Marathon, I intentionally took in no nutrition for many hours before, and then ran the race with no nutrition, and ran at a harder pace than I knew that I could maintain, and I ran until I collapsed. And I ran my best first half split ever. And then at the 20-mile mark, or about 18 and a half miles, completely blacked out. Now, it sounds crazy, but it was actually quite responsible because I was in a reasonably safe environment. I was able to get some gels into me. And what I wanted to find out was how quickly my body could respond. It took me 5-6 minutes to get some clarity. And then I was able to sort of walk to the next aid station, get some electrolytes into me. And in the end, I was able to run, and I actually matched my time from the race before. Now, I would have been a lot faster. I got screwed up. But what I mean, and just to bring it back to your thing about the temperature, is I could then comfortably put myself into a situation where I know how I'm going to be able to respond to that. So again, it's sort of that pre-preparation.
Yeah, that's good stuff. I mean, like even your hands on a paddle, knowing what that point is when you can no longer grip something, but also being comfortable with a point where it's just like, okay, my strength is down 50% because of the temperature. Same thing with your eyes. I've always been a believer, as long as my core is warm, I can expose a lot of my extremities to the variables. So
beyond that, just to get it down to sort of some real tangibles. What are the components? So for example, equipment is one, clothing is another, nutrition is another. So what are the things that you would make sure that you have going into any unsupported situation?
I just want to know what the worst case scenario is that I can see in a situation from the weather, and then if it's whether that's temperature, whether that's wind, whatever that may be. I want to know what, like, historically, what's the worst thing that I could potentially see, and then I want to know, like, how is that going to affect me? That might even be a quantitative type thing, like, so it's just like, okay, what's the highest that the winds could potentially get, and can I move through that? Is it physically possible for me to continue progressing forward through in that type of situation? Because, like, say for example, if you're on something like the Yukon River, well, the winds could get up to, let's say worst case scenario, let's say it was like 40 or 50 miles an hour. Is there some way that you could hunker down and still move forward that? Because if so, you're going to get around a bend probably, and hopefully that'll turn into a tailwind or something like that.
Yep.
Or a
unless you're on the
wind,
Tennessee River, it never turns into a tailwind, I can tell you for sure.
Yeah. But in certain situations, you're covering so much distance that it's actually kind of difficult to find the absolute perfect ideal environment or weather, because if you're covering over 200 miles, well, the weather may be one thing here and then something completely different over here, so it's hard to find something perfect, and then doing a channel crossing. I would love to paddle from Cuba to Key West with a tailwind, doing a downwinder for 90 miles. That would be like
Jimmy
amazing.
Buffett on the radio.
Yeah, but as long as in certain situations, you may just have to say, all right, well, we're give yourselves a 5-day window or something like that. That's all could be relative as well, depending upon what you're trying to do. Like, say for example, the guys that climb Mount Everest, I don't know how many days window that they would like to have once they actually get their shot, K2, whatever, pick your mountain. I don't know how many days they want to have to get a decent weather window, but I'm sure, obviously time is your friend. The more time you have, the better chance you have for those perfect ideal temperatures, wind, those conditions and all that kind of stuff. But, you know, just doing that homework, to studying the history, reading books, talking to other people who've been there. So that way, you know, I turn over every single stone. So that way I kind of know what to do, worst case scenario, talking to people, reading books and all that.
So the idea being knowing what you're getting yourself into.
Yeah, no surprises. Obviously it's a black box, but and it will be a black box no matter what. And so, but because there's certain things that you can never plan for. And let's say like it's an event that has 10 moving parts, you know that at least two of them are going to fail. Maybe five of them are going to fail, but put as many things as you can going to your advantage, whether that's physical stuff, maybe that could be anything, you know, everything is a moving part in itself. And so, yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And in terms of that, it's funny because, you know, I'd like to be able to say, there's always been somebody else who's done it. So get a book or look to YouTube or Google, but that's not the case in a lot of the stuff that you do, or that those of us who are trying to be on the cutting edge do. You know, quite often you're doing things that nobody has ever done. You and I talked a few years ago. I won't divulge what it is here, but you and I talked a few years ago about one of your dream expeditions that you were looking into.
Yeah, we can talk about it. I'm comfortable to talk about it.
Sure.
It's
tell us what that one is, because I think that's incredible.
Yeah, so my goal, something I've wanted to do for a really, really long time, is to cross the Bering Strait. And, you know, it has a lot of, it intrigues me. There's a lot.
So again, for anyone who isn't as strong in geography, the Bering Strait is the body of water that separates essentially Siberia, so the northeastern part of Russia, from Alaska. So think about you're crossing from Cuba to Florida in tropical waters, and then make it a whole lot colder, a whole lot further north. And so I just want people to understand what we're talking about when you talk about crossing the Bering Strait.
Yeah. Alaska to Russia, I would go either way. I've looked at it every single possible way. You've got two islands there in the middle, the Diomede Islands. It's about a 50-mile gap between the two continents. You've got the land bridge underneath there, which is like, you know, phenomenal to think about from the history of our world. But, you know, it's a very difficult thing to do because of geopolitical relationships. With Russia, they really protect this little piece of land there, the Chukotka region, which is the easternmost part of Siberia. So let's say that you're a Russian citizen and you were born in St. Petersburg and you wanted to go visit the Chukotka region. They don't allow you to go there. Really, the only way that you can go there is if you were born there. Now, yes, you can go there if you want to go there for tourism purposes, and you have a very specific itinerary that's like basically specific to tourism. But when somebody's doing like expeditions and stuff like that, it's basically a no-fly zone. I've poured years into trying to get permission to do that crossing, and talked to a lot of people who circumnavigate the world via foot and human power, walking and biking, and most of them have all said that is the hardest part of circumnavigating the world, is getting across the Bering Strait and dealing with the diplomats of Russia. And it's just that one tiny piece of, and it all goes back to the Cold War. Russia, they had it pretty well fortified right there and had a lot of military presence, and they still do to this day, which is a little strange, because if you go across that channel to Alaska, the little town there is called Wales, and there's basically nothing there in the United States. So like, say, for example, from my standpoint, as long as I could get permission from Russia to allow me to go there and then leave the soil paddling back.
Yeah, you're not talking about going and staying and taking pictures. You just want to touch land and start paddling.
Any way possible. And like, I could talk for 2 hours at a million different ways that I've looked at doing that crossing. And you could try to poach it, and which would be, that could go south and go real south, or it could go south and then they could just kind of just say, hey, you're not supposed to do that, and let you go. But you're at the mercy of something a lot bigger than you may want to deal with. And so some people have done it that way, and they've just, one of my friends, who he is still walking around the world and completing his expedition. When he did it, he got detained, and he was detained for about a week. And, you know, he was just like, you could go that route if you wanted, but it's just, you know, it's obviously a huge risk. So.
Well, so in addition to the specifics people have gleaned about, you know, preparation and making sure you know what you're getting into and exposing yourself gradually to things so that when you get into a real life situation, you can deal with it. I hope the other thing that this has done for people is to open their eyes to what is actually possible in terms of endurance. And, you know, we talk about endurance in terms of, you know, 6-hour events and 4-hour events and 12-hour events, and that's all awesome. But I love people now hearing you talk about, oh yeah, my friend who's walking around the world, or me paddling from continent to continent, and realizing that there's always something bigger and more amazing out there. And that's one thing I've loved getting to know people like you and Frank Fumich and Ray have. And, you know, there's just all these people that you think you've done something which is great and is amazing, but then you get talking to somebody who's up to something even bigger, and it's just so inspiring to know that, you know, that there's still more to do. And and that's one of my favorite things. It's funny when you said you could talk for 2 hours about it. You and I did talk for 2 hours about it on a beach in Nicaragua. That's when we first talked about your Arctic crossing. And so I will be one of the most excited people when you get it finished, because I've been following you're planning on it for a while. So hey, brother, thank you so much. Glad to see that you're holding up well during all this pandemic stuff. I know that Chattajack got canceled for 2020 as a physical event. There is going to be a virtual event. And so I look forward to seeing you in real time and space soon, my man.
Likewise. Thanks, Johnny.
This episode of Spartan Up is brought to you by True Form Runner. Conquer your next race with a complete training solution from Spartan and True Form. The Spartan True Form trainer will redefine your running, improve your form, and reduce injury. Save 10% with the code SPARTAN10 at trueformrunner.com/Spartan. That's trueformrunner.com/Spartan.